On October 31st, 1978, death came back to the small town of Haddonfield, Illinois, and hasn't left in 40 years. Michael Myers' first trip back home after 15 years to terrorize Laurie Strode to commemorate the killing of his sister spawned the 80s craze of franchise horror filmmaking, resulting in 11 movies, 9 novels, a line of comic books, and a video game on the Atari 2600. The series became a cultural icon of a time obsessed with youth and beauty, and created horror tropes that are now overused to the point of cliché, and outright defined what the modern slasher genre would be. But over the course of the series, each entry changed slowly to reflect the times that they were made in, and you can see each one making its own statement about what horror was at that particular moment in time. I think thematically, the series can be broken down into 5 distinct eras that share similar values, style, aesthetic, production members, and ideologies. And I am going to try and link them together here, and put into words a way that makes sense for the franchise, in hopes that I can bring more understanding about the long-running series, and to maybe bring appreciation to a franchise that captured America for so long on the eve of its 40th anniversary. As 40 years ago today, the first Halloween movie was released to the theaters, and audiences were introduced to a new kind of horror. There isn't a lot I can say about Halloween that hasn't already been said, and so for that matter, I won't linger on it very long. All I will say is that it started a chain reaction that in a lot of ways can't be really fully understood, that affected not only the horror genre as a whole, but also the careers of hundreds of different people across 4 different decades, that contains conflicting views from different parties involved, and bits of evidence that have been long lost into the past. It not only was at the time the most successful independently produced film of all time, but it rejuvenated the horror film genre and launched a film franchise that spans 11 movies and has an interesting twisting tale that ties them all together behind the scenes. It deserves all of the respect and honor that it has, and more so, because in the fall of 1978, a film made for less than $500,000 changed horror forever and launched the idea of modern horror franchise filmmaking. Starting later that year, work began on the next movie in the franchise, leading to the most interesting behind-the-scenes stories. After the success of Halloween, producer Irwin Yablans was eager to start work on a sequel that was set to begin immediately after the cliffhanger ending of the first film. Carpenter, though, with co-writer Deborah Hill, didn't want to repeat themselves so early into their careers as filmmakers, out of fear that they would be typecasted in connection to the series, and that they wouldn't be able to professionally move on to other types of projects if that were to happen. Yablans, then desperate to get another Halloween movie off the ground, made a deal with Carpenter and Hill to finance their next picture, The Fog, if they agreed to enter negotiations for Halloween 2. Soon after the Yablans deal to produce The Fog, it was publicly announced that Robert Remy would, with his production company Embassy Pictures, be producing 2 new movies that would be written and directed by John Carpenter, 1981's Escape from New York, and also The Fog. Yablans then, out of anger and a feeling of betrayal, did something that would in turn affect the entire long-running history of the Halloween franchise, and sued Remy and Carpenter based on the idea that they were breaking the pre-established deal Carpenter had already made over The Fog. Yablans claimed that the different parties settled out of court, and Carpenter's part of the new deal was that he and Hill would write the script for Halloween 2 for Yablans, as well as act as producers on the picture, but Carpenter would not return to direct it, saying that he had already made that movie once and didn't want to make it again. Carpenter claims, though, that he took the job because he wasn't satisfied with the pay that he got from the first movie, and that he took the job of writing Halloween 2 to compensate for his work on the first film. There really isn't enough evidence to tell which story is more true, but what is evident is that the figures behind the film were resentful of each other before production even began. I think that the conception of Halloween 2, being created out of a lawsuit, hung over the rest of the film and changed the feeling of the movie as a result. Carpenter, in acting as a producer, asked his friend and art director of the first film, Tommy Lee Wallace, but he respectfully refused because he didn't like the level of violence present in the script, although he would later take up the offer when made again to write and direct Halloween 3. After Wallace declined, a new, inexperienced director, Rick Rosenthal, was chosen to helm the film. When watching the movie, you can tell that Rosenthal was in a really tough situation. Not only was it his first movie, but it was also the sequel to the most financially successful independent film of all time. He also had to deal with 5 different producers that had just gotten out of legal battles suing each other, who each had different ideas of how the film should go in terms of tone and story. The film also had to be created in the exact same style as the first movie, because it picks up mere seconds after the first Halloween ends. And so for all of these reasons, I think that Rosenthal should be applauded as a director just for juggling all of those aspects before production of the film even began. You can also tell that Rosenthal studied Carpenter's work on the first film well, because a lot of the trademarks from that movie are present here and done really well. The camera still moves in an uncomfortably slow manner and Steadicam tracking shots that give a very voyeuristic feeling. I feel like the camera work here is on par with the first movie, and the way tensions build slowly echoes the first film in a nice manner as well. You can tell that Rosenthal really wanted this film to feel like a two-parter to the first movie, like a companion piece. And as far as his job is concerned, I think he really executed it nicely. Where the film starts to fall apart though, I believe, is actually with Carpenter and Hill. You can tell that neither really wanted to write the film, as the writing doesn't carry the same grace and style that the first movie offered. Instead of realistic and believable suburban scenarios from the first movie, you have scenes that border on being outlandish, like a nurse and an EMT at the hospital taking a break during a shift to fool around in a hot tub that happens to be in the break area of the hospital. They're also responsible for making the violence more extreme and over the top than it had been in part 1. Yablans, one of the producers, claims that he was the reason that the first film did not show any blood or gore, as he thought that it would be scarier if all the action was held in the theater of the mind. Because what each individual person imagined would be much scarier to them than anything they could actually show on the screen. And it's this notion that makes the first film so scary and effective, as the most you ever see are shots of the Shape carrying away bodies after he's killed them. But the killings themselves are filmed in such darkness that you never really get any details from them at all. But Carpenter and Hill disregard this tactic entirely. Kills in Halloween 2 are bloody and exceptionally violent. Save for 1 or 2, each kill is shown in excruciating detail, with large amounts of blood, burning skin, razors in mouth, and other things like that. It is rumored that at one point a scene was even to be filmed that was going to use nearly 50 gallons of fake blood, but the idea was scrapped hours before filming the sequence. And that isn't a bad thing outright. In fact, some praise the movie for its change in tone from the first one, but in Rosenthal's efforts to film it like the first movie as much as possible, it leaves part 2 feeling schizophrenic when compared to the first at times. In terms of sound, lighting, music, acting, and cinematography, it falls in line well with the series. But Carpenter ratcheting up the violence makes it feel really strange when watching the two as a double feature. Carpenter was in a strange predicament as well though, as his name as an authority figure in horror was on the line. He was stuck making a movie that he didn't want to work on at all, right after coming off of 3 really successful movies in a row, and was wanting to instead be working on The Thing that was slated to come out in 1982. He was at the peak of his power as a creative force in film, and he knew that one bad project could easily ruin his chances of working in the films that he wanted to, in the ways that he wanted to. So, late into production, Carpenter took control of the movie away from Rosenthal, and began to film his own versions of the kill scenes, adding even more blood that had been in the original takes. He also took control of the post-production process, and Rosenthal was essentially pushed out of the project entirely, and wasn't even aware that the ending of the film had been changed until he watched it at the premiere. In between the making of Halloween and Halloween 2, horror had changed. Imitators such as Friday the 13th had cropped up, and the first Halloween that had rejuvenated the horror industry had now in just a few years become dated, in Carpenter's opinion. And it was to this end that the violence was put into the movie. It seems as if Rosenthal and Carpenter never really made amends either, with Rosenthal saying later that Carpenter had ruined his movie. Which is a real shame, because despite the warring producers and inexperienced director, a tough production that was filmed next to an airport, resulting in it being nearly impossible to record sound, and other factors, Halloween 2 is actually a pretty decent movie, and in my opinion, a worthy successor to inherit the name Halloween. The movie looks good, and at the end of the day, even though it feels weird at times, it still feels like a good part 2 and a good conclusion to the Myers and Strode story. It introduces things into the series, while not bad in this movie per se, are certainly my least favorite parts and would eventually be used to the detriment of the series, such as Michael becoming a supernatural character, surviving roughly a dozen gunshots, 2 of which land directly in his eyes, and being burned in a giant wall of flames. It also adds the storyline of Michael and Laurie being related, which adds nothing and only takes away from the mystique of the first movie. But otherwise, it's a really good and solid entry, and honestly should have been the send-off for the series, or at least these characters in the series. If so, it would have been a satisfying end that wrapped up most things, and still left a few strings for the audience to wonder about and discuss. And I think that if Halloween 2 had been the last in the series to feature the character Michael Myers, that it would be remembered today almost as fondly as the first one. Which was originally the plan, as Halloween 2 was seen as the end of a 2-part experience, and the beginning of a new type of franchise. The idea was to have an anthology-style horror series, like The Twilight Zone, that would come out roughly every year and each film would take place on the night of Halloween, with each entry being completely unrelated to the previous ones in the series. Which is how the ball started to roll that eventually led the series to its third entry, Halloween 3: Season of the Witch, which, for a long time, has kind of unfairly been seen as the black sheep of the family. Before I begin, I should say that I hold a probably controversial opinion, because Season of the Witch is actually by far my favorite Halloween movie. A man runs late at night into a gas station, holding only a mask warning that they are coming, who later is taken to the hospital and killed by a man in a suit, who then pours gasoline on himself and kills himself via immolation in the parking lot. This spawns an unusual partnership between a doctor at the hospital and the murdered man's daughter, in which they find themselves on a dangerous mission, traveling to investigate on their own the Silver Shamrock Company that makes the popular line of Halloween masks, dishing out frontier justice along the way. I love the setup for this movie, and it only gets better from there. Tommy Lee Wallace, who as I said originally turned down the chance to work on Halloween 2, took this project on out of excitement of being able to start a new direction for the franchise. As he originally hated the level of violence in the script for the second Halloween, he was able to mold the third movie to fit his vision of the correct tone, as he had more control in this film than he would have in part 2. The script was originally penned by British science fiction writer Nigel Neal, but Dino De Laurentiis, who had money invested in both the second and third films, apparently hated it, saying it wasn't violent enough or scary. So then John Carpenter was brought in to do a second draft, where he fixed a lot of the things that De Laurentiis didn't like. And finally, when Wallace was brought onto the project, he was able to rewrite the script to fit his vision of the film and was credited as the sole screenwriter. Filmed in Lolita, California, which still to this day only has a population of roughly 800 people, the movie feels more like a neo-horror western noir than anything else. The first few scenes are shot in a style reminiscent of the first two movies. The camera moves slowly through the hospital corridors, following the man in the suit, much like Myers would have been filmed before. But around the 20-minute mark, Wallace slowly transitions us into a full-blown western, with large wide shots of Northern California countryside showing the two companions slowly making their way to the small town controlled by the evil corporation. And every shot in the fictional town of Santa Mira breeds malice. I think that it's the best looking in the series, and for me it's one of the only movies along with the first one that actually feels like it takes place in the fall, and I like that. It really is a great movie, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it, especially if you like horror themed around the idea of witchcraft, as all of the horror in this movie comes from spells and not knives, which is really where this film separates itself from the first two movies. It also explores violence directed at children, which is exceptionally rare and actually hard to find in horror movies, as children's bodies in this movie are used as conduits for black magic, and their flesh is used to grow infestations of crickets, snakes, and other sinister beings synonymous with witchcraft. It is the movie that John Carpenter and Deborah Hill had the least hands-on approach with, as they still produced it, but didn't seem to intervene much in the filmmaking process. And Carpenter only wrote an early draft of the script, and returned to write a new score for the movie along with composer Alan Howarth. Given that the new idea for the series was that each movie would be its own thing, Wallace seemed to be given mostly free rein to do as he liked. The only problem came then, that general audiences weren't informed of the new direction of the franchise, and in the fall of 1982, thousands of horror lovers went to the theaters to see the next installment of the story of Michael Myers. The film was critically destroyed, and made the least money out of any Halloween film at the time, and it's still the second lowest grossing film out of all 11. It was pulled from theaters after a mere couple of weeks, and was largely forgotten to time. Wallace spent the next 30 years viewing the film as a horrible failure, and didn't know that the film had a cult following at all until around the time of the Blu-ray release in 2012. And that makes me really sad, because it genuinely is my favorite movie in the series. And if it had just been called Season of the Witch and not Halloween 3, then I think the movie would have had a much better life, and would have grown to have more of a loving following in the decades after its release. But unfortunately, this isn't the case. The movie bombed at the box office, it scorned its fans who expected something different, and it effectively was what was seen as the final nail in the Halloween franchise, as no new films were planned after its failure, and the anthology series idea was scrapped entirely, and the title of Halloween would be placed on the shelf and lie dormant for 6 long years. Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, has one of my favorite openings of any horror movie ever. Halloween decorations hang in a barren landscape at dusk. There's no music, only the land, the decorations, the sound of the wind, and the credits. It oozes a wonderful atmosphere, and starts the movie out in a really nice way. But unfortunately, this opening sequence with Halloween imagery floating in nothingness can symbolically represent the next era of Halloween films. The next phase of movies can be seen as sort of a mythology trilogy within the franchise. They use their time to build up a history and story for Myers and to create a mythology for him, whereas the previous films left his story mostly a mystery. For different reasons, John Carpenter, Deborah Hill, Dino De Laurentiis, and Irwin Yablans all sold their interest to the Halloween franchise, leaving only Mustafa Akkad as the sole producer of the original films to continue the series, becoming the main creative on the project and being the guiding hand of the series from here on. It is important to note how much of an impact he had on the next films of the franchise in general, because if it had not been for him, the series probably would not have continued past Season of the Witch, and there still may only be 2 movies ever that had the character of Michael Myers in it. Akkad, who hated Season of the Witch, decided that for the next movie to succeed, Myers had to be in it. But a lot of issues rose from this. Probably so that he wouldn't ever have to work on another Halloween film again, Carpenter killed the Shape at the end of Part 2, along with Sam Loomis. In an early stage of production, Carpenter and Hill actually worked on a concept of how the idea of Michael Myers would still haunt Haddonfield, even though the man himself was dead. But Akkad rejected this, stating that it was too intellectual of an idea for the Halloween series and that Myers had to come back as a flesh and blood man. The movie ended up just saying that both men survived this explosion, which is an outrageous idea, and I had hoped for something a little bit more creative, but they slapped some burn makeup on Loomis's face and Myers' hands and move on from it fast. Jamie Lee Curtis wouldn't return for this entry either, and went so much as to ask the writers to kill her character via a car crash, sometime in between Part 2 and this movie, so that she wouldn't ever have to come back to the series. So, instead of Laurie, I think the series went with an interesting choice in protagonist by choosing the 8-year-old daughter of Laurie, Jamie Strode. It is really unusual to see such a young child being the main character in a slasher film, but it really works here. The idea here, I think, is that Michael has some sort of curse put on him that makes him immortal and also makes him hunt his family. There's a cult involved and a magical symbol, but none of it is really ever explained or makes much sense. But the gist of the first 2 movies is that Michael is trying to kill Jamie and Loomis has to protect her. The mask in this movie is the worst that is ever used. Because Michael was killed at the end of 2 and the thought of bringing him back at any time was silly, as a gift the production team allowed stuntman George Wilbur to keep the iconic suit and mask used in the first 2 films. And so when it came time to make Part 4, a new mask had to be created from scratch, and the results are pretty bad. It is a problem that continues in Part 5 as well, but was finally fixed in the 6th installment. 4 and 5 should be seen as a 2-parter really, as 6, while still related to 4 and 5, is really its own beast, and is kind of a half-hearted attempt at turning the 3 movies into a trilogy. But 4 and 5 are deeply intertwined as far as storytelling is concerned, which wouldn't be a problem if it weren't for 5 being drastically worse than 4. When The Return of Michael Myers released to theaters, it was a massive hit, causing Mustafa Akkad to quickly try and get a 5th movie into theaters as soon as possible. He said himself that he was drunk off of the success of 4, and that drunkenness, mixed with hubris, made him and his team think that they could accomplish more than they really could. 5 has its moments, and if you like 4, then you'll probably like this too, but for the most part it feels really rushed and isn't very memorable. It is where the cult subplot started to be played with, but the writers admitted later that they had no clue what it meant, and they had no plans for it, when they were asked by Daniel Faradz, who was writing Halloween 6. There are a few good bits here. The laundry chute scene involving Michael and Jamie is particularly good. A large portion of the film also takes place during the day, which is unusual for the franchise save for the first movie, but was a welcome element. But for the most part, if you've seen the first few movies, then 5 won't have anything that surprises you. And it's here that I should mention something that I haven't talked about yet. Sam Loomis, the hellbent psychiatrist trying to stop Michael at any cost, is a dangerous lunatic, and he's at his craziest here. Donald Pleasance is a great actor. Any scene that he's in, he outshines anyone he's with, but the character he plays really is crazy and shouldn't be helping anyone with mental health. In the first 2 movies, he runs around in a trench coat with a gun, waving it anywhere, yelling things to complete strangers like, "You don't know what death is," while simultaneously ordering cops around like he's the sergeant. He fires a gun next to an officer's ear just to get his attention. He wades in a river while wearing a suit and shoes, but in Part 5, he ratchets up the crazy to a whole new level. Here he sets up a plan to trick all of the cops into going the opposite direction that Myers is really hiding, so that he, a 70-something-year-old man, can take him on himself. This results in the death of 2 police officers, and he even gets desperate enough that he uses 9-year-old Jamie as a bait to get Myers to follow him down a hall, holding her out in front of him like she's a shield. He beats Michael unconscious with a plank of wood, but if this had not worked, he would have gotten himself and Jamie killed along with the 2 officers he already did. At the end of the day, both 4 and 5 are just okay movies. But if you like magic and cult-related horror, then there might be something here for you, but to me it feels lazy, as it really just acts as a way to get them to be able to have Michael survive massive damage in each film and still come back the next time. The worst of this period of movies, though, is definitely The Curse of Michael Myers, and it's one of 3 movies in the series that is outright bad and should just be avoided. After the lukewarm reception to 5, Akkad waited until the mid-90s to finish the story that had been started in the previous 2 films. But they started filming with a script that wasn't good and tried to fix it with reshoots halfway through, leaving the final film incomprehensible. I have watched the movie all the way through, but I still struggle to put into words what actually happens in it. It tries to wrap up the trilogy, but by this point Donald Pleasance was very sick and couldn't film many scenes, and the character of Jamie was recast. The entire last act of the movie was rewritten completely, removing a lot of the explanation as to the meaning of the cult, leaving the build-up feeling empty as well. There are some highs in this era, but for the most part, because of the way that things turned out, they feel like the opening to part 4, with those Halloween decorations hanging there with nothing of substance around them. Which is a shame, because it really does start off well. The Return of Michael Myers is a surprisingly good 4th movie in a franchise. It's just less good knowing what would become of the storyline that it works to set up. But overall, it was an okay time for the series, with only 1 bad movie but 2 other fairly forgettable ones. And it seems that with part 6, the series had finally entered the phase where most horror franchises enter a state of diminishing returns, and decide to release all future installments straight to home video with a much smaller budget. But that didn't happen, because of a surprising turn that would go on to save the series. The next era of Halloween began 3 years later and consisted of 2 films. The series was saved, and was able to then go on to have the future it has had because of the actions of Jamie Lee Curtis at the time of the release of The Curse of Michael Myers. She decided that to celebrate her 20th anniversary as a film actress, that she would like to return to the role of Laurie Strode and bring as many of the original behind-the-scenes crew with her to make the 20th anniversary celebration of the series, which resulted in the first film since part 4 where a considerable amount of effort, money, and time was put into it. John Carpenter was even set to return to write and direct, but that was also short-lived as this started back a 20-year feud with Mustafa Akkad, who laughed at Carpenter's $10 million asking price. Carpenter felt that this price was fair considering that he had still not been paid well for the first Halloween movie, but Akkad refused, and so Carpenter's contributions to the final film is negligible. H2O is tied with the newest film as my favorites in the franchise that features Michael Myers. Everything in this movie just works. Jamie Lee Curtis's willingness to come back to the franchise after so many years brought about a feeling of importance and legitimized the series once again. And the movie carries the weight of actually trying to tell a compelling story that acts as the conclusion of the Laurie Strode character. It is the only one out of the franchise thus far to really care about developing character, and it actually has arcs that forces change in the way that the people in the story act. At the start of the film, we find a traumatized Laurie who is a heavy drinker. We see her guzzle 2 glasses of wine on screen during lunch, and the movie in a lot of ways is about her overcoming her past and growing as a person. And I really like that this movie tried in this regard where others didn't. If parts 4 through 6 are a trilogy within a franchise, then H2O should be seen as the last chapter of a trilogy, finishing up the story laid out by parts 1 and 2. It totally ignores the events of 3 through 6, effectively writing the character of Jamie and the later years of Sam Loomis out of the canon, which at the time was a very controversial and divisive decision. But it was a decision that worked, because in simplifying the timeline and getting rid of some of the more outlandish elements of the mythology trilogy, allowed them to focus on giving the characters of Laurie Strode and Michael Myers a proper send-off and one last adventure. The film finds Laurie, now hiding under the name Carrie Tate, who has moved to California and gotten a position at a prestigious private school. Having never had a daughter named Jamie, this version of Laurie has a son named John, and the two, along with other students and faculty of the academy, have to defend the school from Myers, as he attempts to break into the school on his unrelenting hunt to kill Laurie. The cinematography is really outstanding here at times, and it has the highest production values out of any of the Halloween films, save for the newest one. It feels like a real movie again, something which the previous sequels lacked more and more each time. It honestly really doesn't do anything wrong at all, and so there isn't much I can say about it, other than it's one of the heights for the franchise for me, as it acts as the big payoff that the first 2 movies set up. It feels like a Halloween movie made for the modern age. It keeps the tropes and feel of the old movies, but elevates them and refines them for a post-Scream world. It feels very 90s at times, but it shows how a good slasher flick in the times of everyone knowing everything about slasher movies can be made. It should have been the perfect ending for the series because it wraps up everything in a tight package, and from here it only just goes downhill. Jamie Lee Curtis went on to say that she had originally wanted more from this film, and what started as an idea made of good intentions eventually turned into just a paycheck for her, which is sad in a way that she was disappointed in how this film turned out, because being the 7th film in a horror franchise and actually turning out to be one of the best is an accomplishment in its own right. But it's also less sad for me because I feel like she got what she wanted out of H2O in the new 2018 film. I think she was seeking a respectful way to symbolically send off the character that had given her her start. And she was really lucky that she was given that chance twice. And I hope she emotionally got out of this new film what she wanted from H2O, because I think she deserves it. The only real major problem then with this movie at all is that it sets up the next film, Halloween Resurrection, which is easily the worst entry into the franchise and one of the worst horror sequels ever made. The idea for H2O was that it was the end of one story and the beginning of the next part of the long-running endless tale of Michael Myers. The only problem with that is that Laurie cuts his head off at the end of H2O, ending the story for good. Curtis apparently tried to quit the movie at one point when she learned that they had planned to change how H2O was set to end and have Michael survive, as part of Akkad's contract allowed him to decide whether or not he would die, and he didn't want the character to die because that would mean that they wouldn't be able to make more sequels. So to appease her so that she would stay on board the project, they left the ending of H2O alone, and decided to open up Resurrection with 2 nurses talking about how the end of H2O didn't actually happen and that Myers never really died. It's really lazy, and again, really disrespectful to the fans of the series. In order to get H2O off the ground, Curtis had to agree in her contract to a cameo in this film as well, which is the first scene of the movie, and it's really awful. It involves Curtis kissing Michael, telling him that she will see him in hell before plunging off a roof to her death. It was a super disrespectful way to kill a character that had such a long history and sets a really bad tone for the rest of the movie. Which doesn't really matter in the long run because the movie would have done that for itself either way. It really is horrible and dates itself within minutes of the movie starting. It depicts reality TV culture of the early 2000s as a group of kids go into the Myers house to spend the night to film an episode of a horror reality show. It's full of references to things like Survivor that haven't aged well at all. The film also has this weird, strange handheld look to it for a large portion of the time, as each of the characters have cameras mounted to their chest that is frequently the viewpoint that we are given to see the action. So, a series that is known for its slow, well-paced, Steadicam movements devolves here into shaky, low-quality footage to add scares. It is in decisions like this that I think it is really interesting to look at each film as a product of the decade that it was made in. And it's really evident here the time period in which Resurrection was made. Whereas H2O had to make Halloween relevant in a good way for the 90s, Resurrection takes from movies like The Blair Witch Project in ways that don't fit the series at all, making a jumbled mess of a movie that is in some way representative of what horror valued at this time. And it's part of the reason why I argue that Halloween should have just stayed in the 80s and not moved on past the second one, because it's a franchise that is very rooted in a certain style of filmmaking, and when it tries to conform to modern trends it fails every time, which is very noticeable in this movie as well as the next 2 sequels that conform to a Saw and Hostel style of gritty gore-soaked horror. But the movie is bad all around. It is the only movie where you can constantly see Michael's eyes behind the mask, making him look really goofy. Someone gets killed with a camera stand that which for some inexplicable reason has blades on the end of it, and Michael Myers, the man who has survived multiple explosions, dozens of gunshot wounds, 2 of which land in his eyes, gets killed in a kung fu battle with Busta Rhymes. That's not even a joke, it's literally how the movie ends. The strangest part about the whole thing is that it was made by Halloween 2 director Rick Rosenthal. After the attitude he had towards the style and violence in that film, and how he felt after John Carpenter took control away from him on the project and ruined the movie, in his opinion, one would assume that he would try to make the best film possible here. He expressed anger that the well-paced script for Halloween 2 was ruined by mandates between bickering parties, but he then went on with his next installment to do everything he hated about the first one. It is overly violent, and seems to be the antithesis of what Rosenthal wanted to do with the franchise originally, and makes me really curious where his thought process went. Because you see a man change from wanting to create the best product possible, to moving on even beyond self-parody with this joke of a movie. The film opened 4th place that weekend, ironically opening at the same time and performing worse than the next film written by Matt Greenberg, the writer of H2O. It killed the timeline of the franchise that H2O carefully set up, and any sequels that were supposed to be made were cancelled, and the films were stalled for several years until the decision was reached that they just had to be rebooted because what was there just couldn't be salvaged anymore. On November the 9th, 2005, the longtime producer of the film series, Mustafa Akkad, was murdered along with his daughter in a devastating terrorist attack in Amman, Jordan. The rights to the series, along with the character of Michael Myers, was passed to his son, Malek Akkad, meaning that for the first time since the series began, the future of the series was in control by someone who didn't work on the first film. Bob and Harvey Weinstein, who had been producers on both H2O and Resurrection, came up with the idea of rebooting the franchise for a modern audience, and sought out director Rob Zombie to helm the project, who was just coming off of horror successes like House of a Thousand Corpses and The Devil's Rejects. Zombie consulted with John Carpenter about the film, and Carpenter gave his blessing, saying only that he wanted Zombie to make the film his own, which, in my opinion, he certainly did. The movie spends a lot of time on Michael's childhood, and tries to make sense of why he is the way that he is, using the character of Loomis and his psychological evaluations as a mean to look inside the child's mind. The actual plot of the original Halloween doesn't begin until roughly halfway through the movie, and they go out of their way to make sure that the audience understands Michael as a person rather than a force in this movie more than any in the series. I am normally a fan of Rob Zombie's everyone's a redneck and insane and acts like porn is their side job and is more than likely a psychopath as well personal brand of horror that he developed into his own style based on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it doesn't suit Halloween at all. The horror from the original film derived from bad things happening to people that it normally doesn't happen to. It took place in white, upper-middle-class suburbia in the late 70s, and suddenly people who were socially on top of the world are being butchered like animals. And so in the remake, where everyone is acting like they would in House of a Thousand Corpses, it just doesn't jive with the tone normally set from the beginning of the franchise that this is mostly in service to. And it being in service to the original Halloween is honestly one of the bigger detractors from the movie. It is constantly paying reverence to the original in small ways, but it quickly becomes gratuitous as this film is constantly excessive to the point of being exhausting. They play Mr. Sandman twice. They play Don't Fear the Reaper twice. They watch The Thing from Another World twice. The little nods to the original are charming at first, but quickly become distracting, and as the movie continues, it just gets worse. The movie is constantly trying to pay respects to the original while also trying to outdo it. The remake continues for another 20 minutes after the original story ends, but there's no need or point to any of this. Everything still plays out the same. It just takes longer to get there, and it's a long movie. At over 2 hours in runtime, it is the longest in the series by a country mile and already outstays its welcome by the halfway point. It is exceptionally violent in uncreative ways, and what starts out as a fun experiment feels like a chore to finish. But it being longer doesn't mean that it's all bad, as it does open the film up for small moments of greatness that is sprinkled in. I love that this is really the only movie in the franchise that really uses Michael's height to its advantage. Played by the 6'8", 300-pound monster that is Tyler Mane in both films, Myers here is really physically intimidating. He looms above everyone in the cast, has to bend down to get through doorways, and is my personal favorite out of all the actors to play the character as an adult. He has such a presence about him in the first movie, and it's the only time that the concept is really sold throughout the entire experience that Michael is an unstoppable, unrelenting force of nature. It's really the only time that he looks like he can't be beaten, and if this film does anything right, it's this. The other great casting decision here is Malcolm McDowell, who fills the large shoes left behind by Donald Pleasance in the role of Samuel Loomis. He's really fantastic in every scene, and by playing the character over a 15-year period, he gets to play around by changing him subtly throughout his performance. Pretty much everything he does is great, and the film is lifted a few notches from him just being there. Danny Trejo also plays a character here instead of his usual action self, and gets to stretch his character muscles as the kind custodian that works in the mental facility that Michael is held in. In just a few scenes, he really makes you care for him, and is one of his better non-action roles. Danielle Harris, who you will recognize as the younger Jamie Strode from 4 and 5, returns to the franchise as a new character, Laurie's best friend Annie. It's nice to see her coming back to the series in some form, and she does well here with the few scenes that she has. The film is really well shot for the most part, and you can tell that they used their budget where it counted. The film came out in 2007, and it was a huge success, gaining even more money than H2O that had the gimmick of bringing back Jamie Lee Curtis. And so, in following a tradition with the series, after a passable entry comes out and makes some money, the powers behind the scenes rushed out a sequel to maximize profits, and Halloween 2 was pushed along to a release date in 2009, leaving only 2 years to write, film, and complete post-production on the project. Rob Zombie didn't want to return to the sequel, as the process of making the first one was so taxing both physically and creatively that he couldn't imagine turning around and doing it all over again. And this is where it already begins to fall apart, because despite the feeling of exhaustion, he returned out of fear of someone else ruining his vision of the story, combined with the promise of near total creative freedom. Malek Akkad, who was so impressed with the first entry into the new series, told Zombie that he had complete faith in him to deliver a new story that was entirely his own vision, and that the rules imposed on him during the first film would no longer apply to the sequel, and that the producers would take a nearly hands-off approach, letting things play out as they happened. This turned out to be a really bad decision. Halloween 2 is a horrible movie, and is the second worst in the series behind Resurrection. The movie starts out okay, and is really similar to the feeling of the other Halloween 2. They both start with Laurie getting taken to the hospital right after the events of the previous film, with Michael arriving to cause mayhem. But things really start turning into shambles when it is revealed that the entire sequence that makes up the first 26 minutes of the movie has been a dream. None of it actually happened, and was just an entire waste of time. It's almost like Rob Zombie wrote himself into a corner about 30 pages or so into the script and didn't want to start over again, so he just had it be a dream. It's insulting to the audience, it's lazy, and the movie does this constantly. It's actually pretty funny in places too, like this scene where Sam Loomis walks out on a stage to give a lecture that literally consists of about 2 or 3 sentences, where he then opens the floor to questions, only to explode in a fit of rage when someone asks a question that he doesn't like, and it then cuts to his agent telling him to wrap it up. Like, this entire sequence of events, if it were to happen in real life, would be like at least an hour, but is presented and taking place over the course of about 40 seconds. And it's just really silly editing decisions like this that hold the film back. Because in a minute or so, you see Malcolm McDowell being funny, academic, sad, and angry in such a short amount of time that it makes him seem like he has a personality disorder, which he honestly might. His character is really bad here across the board. Everything right with him the first time around is wrong here, and he's really unlikable, which is sad. He's verbally abusive towards women, he makes profits off the victims of his failed patients, he's narcissistic, fake, and that makes me really sad because Malcolm McDowell has always been one of my favorite performers. And it's not his fault here either. It almost entirely lies with the lackluster script and poor editing decisions during the process that ruined his character. Laurie is even less likable here though, and it's rare that I root for 2 main characters to get killed by a villain like I do in this movie. She literally doesn't go a scene without telling someone to go F themselves or screaming at someone for no reason. She has no redeeming qualities at all, and isn't really nice to anyone once in the film. She also has no agency, as men show up constantly throughout the movie to save her. Most of them don't even have names, they just show up to save her and get killed, so that she can move on to the next one. You can tell that Zombie was really burnt out when making this movie, as at the same time it doesn't feel like a Halloween movie or have an identity of its own. It's just a mess, and also features a horrible subplot involving dream sequences in which Michael's mother, who died in part 1, comes back in the form of an angel. And I honestly think that this might have been a scheme to get more money from the studio, as Zombie's wife, Sherry Moon Zombie, plays the character in both movies. The sequences have some nice imagery that speaks to the Twin Peaks fan in me, but they overall lack any significant meaning. They make no sense, and they don't belong in the series. One of them also happens in the beginning of the movie, which, as I said, ends up being a dream that Laurie is having. So in Laurie's dream, Michael has his own dream, and it's laughable how little the whole thing is thought out. It's just a bad movie, and even beginning to talk about it makes it all fall apart, so it's just best to leave it alone. It came out and was immediately destroyed critically. But that didn't stop the Weinstein Company from trying to rush out a sequel just 1 year later, titled Halloween 3D, that would feature Laurie on the run from Michael and a mental institution. Rob Zombie refused to come back again for a third film, that was pushed back to 2011, then again to 2012, before it was finally cancelled that year. So it seemed, at least for a time, that the long-running 10-film series that had started the horror franchise boom had finally died and placed to rest, and ended with a whimper rather than a bang. But that's not the case, because Halloween is back. I was holding off on making this video until I saw the new one that just came back, because this movie, along with the remake of Dario Argento's Suspiria, were the 2 films this year that I was the most hyped about. It's not perfect, but I did love it. The Doctor subplot was dumb, things happened a little too conveniently, but honestly that doesn't matter to me because of how enjoyable it was. It really is a giant celebration of the series and feels like Halloween H2O 2.0. It constantly takes the best scenes from other movies in the series and remixes them in ways that are a lot better. It takes the bathroom sequence from H2O and does it better. It takes the intro from Halloween 2 and redoes it, but now in a long uninterrupted shot that is the best part of the movie. It redoes the end of the first film, but better. It really is playful too in ways that I don't want to spoil, but it constantly takes shots from other movies and replaces Michael in them with Laurie. If you've seen the other movies in the franchise, then this will be even better for you. And it did the best thing that it could possibly do and made Halloween and horror cool again. With LeBron James wanting to make a Friday the 13th movie and Robert Englund confirming that he wants to make new Nightmare movies, along with his appearance in character on The Goldbergs recently, it seems that we might be in the right time for a horror renaissance. And my only hope now is that the powers that be in the Halloween franchise learn what history has to say, and use this success for more success, and not rush their hand with a bad sequel which has literally happened every other time in the franchise. I am hopeful, and I am happy that Halloween is back. With the success of the recent film has had in only 1 week, maybe we'll have another 40 years to look forward to. I don't know for sure, but what I can say is that, at least for right now, the small quiet town of Haddonfield, Illinois has at least a few more restless Halloween nights to look forward to.
Happy, happy Halloween, 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 happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock. Happy, happy Halloween, 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 happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock.
It's almost time, kids. The clock is ticking. Be in front of your TV sets for the Horathon. And remember the big giveaway at 9. Don't miss it. And don't forget to wear your masks. The clock is ticking. It's almost time.
Happy, happy Halloween, Halloween.